Good evening and welcome to Wild Live from the Wildlife Trusts, the second one from the Wildlife Trusts in March. And that's because we have the wonderful opportunity to have a Wildlife here at Hawkwood, the beautiful Hawkwood in Stroud. And before we get into anything else, I want you to find out a little bit more tonight about this amazing place that I've been coming to with work for years, Hawkwood. So over to Alicia Carey, who's the Chief Executive of Hawkwood, just outside Stroud, to tell us a little bit about this very special place.
Yes, thank you so much, Craig. So it's lovely to see you all here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. As Craig said, my name is Alicia Carey and I'm Chief Executive of Hawkwood. And just for those of you who don't know, Hawkwood is a wonderful charity which creates education programs, residencies, festivals, events like this tonight. And we work in the areas of the arts, transformative leadership, well-being and sustainability. And we really believe it's important to address those pressing issues of our time, really. So the event tonight is absolutely crucial and really aligns with our values. And it is a great pleasure to have so many Hawkwood friends here on the stage this evening. So a huge welcome to them all and to you for being here tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Brilliant. Please give Hawkwood a big round of applause. So the topic, the very important topic for the discussion tonight, is to ask the question, how can we, the UK, meet our energy needs while protecting landscapes and delivering nature's recovery? And of course we're asking that because the still relatively new Labour government set itself the commitment, the mission in fact, to deliver clean power in the UK by 2030. And behind that is, of course, a commitment to double onshore wind in this country, to triple solar power, to quadruple offshore wind capacity, and of course also the installation of a lot of transmission lines and so on to deliver that. And this is an interesting one, of course, for the environmental movement and environmental organisations, because right across the environmental movement we care passionately about the need to tackle climate change, of course, and I think you'll find very few people that would argue against trying to move to clean power, to 100% renewable energy as fast as possible to tackle climate change. But obviously, people are sometimes concerned about the impact that new energy infrastructure, whether it be renewable energy infrastructure or any infrastructure, but certainly the impact that new energy infrastructure can have on the environment, be that landscapes or nature. So this feels like a very important discussion for us to be having. And we have pulled together the most amazing panel to help us take us through this tonight. We have Juliet Davenport, who will be known to many of you watching, and certainly those of you here tonight at Hawkwood, the founder of Good Energy, that fantastic renewable energy company that so many people watching, I'm sure, will be customers of, and a real leader in this space. And many other things besides, but we'll get to that in a moment, a little bit more here about Juliet. We have Roger Mortlock, who's Chief Executive of the campaign to protect rural England, CPRE, the countryside charity, but also formerly the Chief Executive of Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, so formerly of this parish, as it were, Roger, and great to have you with us. And then also Emma Pinchbeck, the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee. A fantastic panel put together there. And I think I should also declare that both Juliet and myself are also advisory commissioners on the government's Clean Power Advisory Commission. So we're actually advising government about how to deliver on that clean power target. And my particular interest is this interaction between climate and energy and nature. So if you allow me tonight, I might actually say a few more and share a few more of my own thoughts that I normally do in my chairing position as well. And the panel can always try and shut me up if they think I'm saying way too much. But let's get into it because there is a lot to discuss. And I'll start with you first, if I can, Juliet. You know, I said that you've been a real pioneer in this space around renewable energy for many years. You also, of course, you sit on a number of boards now, not least the Crown Estate. And I'll ask you a little bit about that in a moment. And also a company called Connected Curb, which I'm interested to hear a bit more about for my own personal reasons. Let's just get into that. So just tell us very briefly, for people that don't know, what is the Crown Estate, this organisation you sit on the board of, and why is it relevant for this issue?
Okay, so you want me to do that briefly?
Very briefly.
So the Crown Estate essentially is an estate that includes property in London, rural properties, but also the seabed. And it is owned by the Crown, but it is run by the Crown Estate Commissioners, and the income from it goes to the Treasury. So it's quite an interesting organisation. The reason it's become so important in the energy transition debate is because obviously the leasing of the seabed for offshore wind is becoming increasingly important. And indeed, some of the coastal bringing in of some of the power lines as well is also integral to that. So yes, it is a debate, and I was very lucky to be one of the first commissioners who had an energy background to join the commission, to join the board. And we've been having some really interesting debates about both community and environment related to the energy transition.
Okay, great. And briefly, also about connected curb. I don't know about that, but I'm interested because I'm hoping it might be the solution I'm looking for.
Well, it might be. It's slightly less associated to tonight's debate, but Connected Curb is a public curbside charging organisation that really has been looking to try and enable people who don't have driveways to be able to park their cars on the public highway and charge them. And essentially the technology is mainly underground, but it looks a little bit like an old parking meter.
Yeah.
And you can charge using those. And they work with local authorities. Gloucestershire is one of the local authorities that we work with.
Okay, so I have a personal interest in this because we don't have
Craig.
we don't have off-road parking at home, but have electric cars. So this. I'll talk to you later.
Okay.
Over a drink. I want to hear more about this. But anyway, Juliet, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Juliet, can you just start us off? Where are you coming from in this debate? How can we meet energy needs while protecting landscapes and delivering nature's recovery?
So 25 years ago, when I first started getting involved in this sector, I think the total amount of renewable electricity being delivered was about 2% of our power sector was being delivered by renewables. Today, we are at about 50%. So that's a huge movement towards that.
And it's worth saying a lot of people don't realise that. A lot of people in the mainstream just don't realise how much of our electricity we're already getting from renewables.
Yeah, and it's an amazing shift over that period of time, a complete transformation of our energy system. But the big but here, and there are two buts. One is on a carbon side, and I'll come back to that. The other one is actually on a geopolitical side. So our energy prices are still being set by gas. It is the marginal plant within our power system, and it means that we basically outsource the volatility in our power prices to organisations, to countries like Russia. So all the issues we've seen related coming through in our power costs have been related to gas coming through on that. And if we want to then look at the carbon side of that, we need to transform the heating side too. So not only do we need to address the electricity and power side, but gas is predominantly our heating fuel. So if we're going to move away from those two, then we're going to have to continue to increase, as you outlined at the beginning, Craig.
Now, I know a particular interest of yours over many years has been the potential benefits of renewable energy specifically for communities.
Yes.
And actually how it shifts power in a different sense to electric power, but power in society and power in the energy sector from big companies to communities. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think this was part of why I became so interested in renewables, is because it becomes an answer not just on the environmental side, but also on a wider economic societal side. So if you put a solar panel on your roof, immediately you transform, one, your relationship with power, but two, who you give money to. So essentially, as soon as you pay off the income, the total cost of that, you are generating your own power. The money that you are spending on your power is not going to another country. It's not going to potentially a country that you don't particularly like. So the complete shift in terms of the economic benefit to you and to who you are not paying suddenly shifts. And I had a debate or a slight argument actually with somebody, a friend of mine who was a diplomat in Austria at the time. And I said, it's very unlikely that you're going to go to war with a solar panel. I mean, there are many other things in terms of our energy system that could provoke war, but solar panels generally aren't those. And so I think for me, this kind of concept that suddenly a community could generate its own power, an individual could generate its own power, you change the dynamic between who controls the end of the pipeline.
Absolutely. And what do you consider to be at the moment the potential benefits for nature of renewables? I mean, over and above, beyond obviously helping tackle climate change, which is in itself a huge threat to nature. But what are the examples you've seen about when renewables can be done in a nature positive way? And what's your hope for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually where the debates like tonight and the planning process becomes incredibly important. So that actually if we push developers, we shouldn't allow developers just to develop anything anywhere. We should push developers to think about the impact it's going to have and what else you can do. So one of the things I always feel slightly sad about is that we developed quite a lot of solar parks back in 2012, 2013. And we did a lot of nature positive work around there. There was one particular site where we had a bunch of slow worms. We moved them all off site and then we moved them back on site afterwards. Now that site now must be just, because it was a scrambler site before, so it had motorbike racing around it. So this site now must have huge numbers of slow worms on it. And the sort of nature recovery and the soil recovery related to those sites, I feel slightly sad that I didn't put a research project in place to make sure that we're monitoring that. And I think it's one of the things we should look at is how do we recover our soils and parts of our nature at the same time as doing development of renewables.
Absolutely. And very briefly, you know, can you discuss some of what do you see as some of the inevitable landscape changes that may occur due to climate change, you know, if we don't change
I mean, obviously the UK is quite, the specifics to the UK is we are likely to see more flooding. So that is going to change our landscape. It's going to change the way we use certain land. So because it's going to make it more difficult to use it as agricultural land. You may get salination as well as you get sort of creep in and coastal erosion. I mean, we're not seeing it as much in the UK, definitely seeing it in India. A lot of the agricultural land that was previously capable of supporting agriculture can't do that anymore. So yeah, I think we're mainly going to see a wet and windy impact. I don't think we'll see the fires that we're seeing in California or in Spain, but Emma probably can tell more than that.
We'll get to what I do in a moment, but one of the things that we're going to do is publish the adaptation advice to government next year, which includes discussing the impacts of climate change on the UK economy and how we might adapt to it. And actually, wildfire is a risk, and so it's wildfire. It's extreme heat in the summer, including wildfire, and then extreme cold snaps potentially, but also generally wetter and windier, which is great news if you live in the West Country. Sorry, as I do.
And it was only, 3-4 years ago, we were seeing wildfires on Saddleworth Moor in winter, you know, just outside Manchester. It was extraordinary to experience that. Yeah.
So, I mean, and I think, so when we look at the climate adaptation, I think the UK will have a specific, but worldwide we will see completely different dramatic impacts on landscape.
Right. Well, Juliet, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's going to be great to have your input into the Q&A when we get to it. So thanks very much for setting us off. So next up is Roger Mortlock, I said before, Chief Executive of CPRE, the countryside charity. Roger, tell us a little bit about CPRE before we get into this topic.
Yeah, so CPRE, we're 100 next year, actually. So we've been around for a long time. And I guess, you know, our kind of ambition has not changed much, which was to create a sort of thriving and a beautiful, not a very popular word at the moment, but yeah, I'm going to stick with a beautiful countryside for everyone. Interestingly, this whole idea around energy infrastructure has been part of our history throughout that period. But I guess, you know, if we look back at some of the things that CPRE has done that I think are emblematic of what we're trying to do, you know, I think CPRE is one of the founding partners in the National Parks movement. I think we wouldn't have a green belt if it wasn't for CPRE, probably not the most, a sort of more controversial idea at the moment. But perhaps, I think, Tristram Hunt, who runs the V&A, who did a version of our history when we were 80, said CPRE's crowning glory is its forceful work to create what is now the Town and Country Planning Act in 1947. So if I were to think of something that CPRE, that almost frames for me what CPRE is about. It's about that balancing of place, of people, of growth, of happiness that comes in that really inspiring bit of Labour legislation. I keep trying to remember that when they remind them that they are the architects at the same time that the post-war Labour government created these amazing things like our national parks. They also created this amazing piece of planning legislation they seem less keen on sometimes at the moment.
Roger, thank you very much. So with all that background, how would you say, how does CPRE approach this question of how can we meet our energy needs while protecting landscapes and delivering nature's recovery?
Well, I think it's important to say that the starting point for all of us in the room, I think, is not about that we have to do it, it's about how we do it. And so it's about, for me, it's about choices, and it's significantly about choices about land and about how we engage with people. And I think on the choice thing, there are really, we don't have to look very far to find people who are tackling this problem really differently. So, in Denmark, they are working towards a 2040 target to underground all their pylons. So that's a decision they have made because they believe that that's a really important thing to do for the landscape. In Germany, they've got 80% of their solar comes from rooftop solar. That's a decision they've made that they've really invested in. So I think there are choices we can make, and I think sometimes in and I get that there's this rush around speed, which I completely buy, and there's also not much money around at the moment. So in that kind of cost-constrained rush, that sometimes we can forget that there are choices. But I think let's just hold on to the choices. I think for a small island, it's worth thinking about finite land as well. As Huckleberry Finn says, we're not making it anymore, so let's think about that. And I think one of the terrifying impacts of climate change is that we're importing quite a lot and a growing amount of our food already. I think about 60% of our best and most versatile farmland will probably be underwater by 2050. That's a terrifying figure. And despite the advice, and I'm very pleased to say, despite what Angela Rayner said yesterday in the House of Commons in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, and despite the advice of the National Planning Policy Framework, 84% of the solar we have, ground-mounted solar, has been on agricultural land classification grades 1 to 3. So we don't subdivide, this is a bit too technical, we don't subdivide grade 3 so you can get into, but that's some of our best land. So most of the solar we're putting on is on fairly good quality agricultural land. And then finally about people, and then Emma, I've nicked this line from you actually, but I don't think the problem is about, Juliet will disagree, but the problem might not be how delivering the infrastructure. The problem, perhaps the biggest problem, is how we take people with us. And I think we don't have to look very far, as in perhaps over the Atlantic, to see what the terrible pendulum swing of public opinion can do in that road to net zero if you don't take people with you. So I think, choices about land, but also about taking people with you.
Very good. I think for what it's worth, I think Juliet's violently agreeing with you. But anyway,
yeah, I think I completely agree on the people that there are some other challenges. There aren't that many transformers around, apparently, especially since Heathrow blew one up the other day.
Is that the officials? That's a new conspiracy about what happened at Heathrow.
Yes,
I haven't heard.
I know. But yeah, so I think it is one of the biggest challenges. There are challenges to delivery as well, but the people one is a massive one.
And I think it's important. We did a piece of work last year with, a slightly surprising piece of work for CPRE to work with the Aldersgate Group, who are sort of representing a lot of business interests, and with Renewable UK, which was about this consensus approach to net zero. And I think, one of the things I'm proud about in CPRE's history is that big tent convening role that CPRE's had. And I think on this issue, as with others, we've got an important role to bring those various focuses and opinions about land use into the same room.
So Roger, I said before, I mean, you've got obviously a background in nature. You were previously Chief Executive of Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust. And of course, we're in Gloucestershire now in Stroud, Chief Executive there for 9 years. Previously, you were also Deputy Director at the Soil Association. You've done other amazing things in your career, like work for the Royal Shakespeare Company as well and things like that. But the reason I'm pulling up the nature piece is because, you know, there is sometimes a bit of a tension, isn't there, between landscape and nature. You know, they're not, sometimes people blur them as if they're exactly the same thing, but they're not quite. Do you want to talk about that a bit? And how do you as CPRE wrestle with what you might consider landscape value and nature value when they don't align?
Yeah, I think landscape's it's a bit like the beauty word. It's not having its most popular moment at them. I mean, I'm delighted, as you would imagine, to see nature at the fore in a lot of these debates. But I think landscape isn't, and I think it's worth just kind of doing a bit of definition about what landscape is and what it isn't. And I think, you know, three of us live in this beautiful place, and I know it feeds us, and I think that's
for people that don't know, Stroud is just in the Cotswolds.
It's
Yeah,
a very,
it is beautiful.
very beautiful bit of the Cotswolds as well. But I think landscape is about the relationship that people have with place, and that's defined in lots of different ways. Some of them are really tangible, like how's nature performing in that place is something you can measure. What's the topography of the place? You know, that you can measure that. But it also is about some things that are more intangible, about the culture, about its identity, about how it makes your heart sing, about, you know, when the poets were writing from the trenches about the English countryside, they weren't writing back about the numbers of declining bits of wildlife. They were writing about how the landscape had an impact on their heart and soul. And I think that's what landscape's about. It's harder to measure. It's not particularly politically popular at the moment, but it sits in the hearts of many people who care about the place they live in.
So both of these things are important. Landscape value is important.
Yeah.
Nature values are important. But it's worth pulling that out, isn't it? Because I think sometimes in the media these things are blurred. Sometimes, you know, you hear discussions that a particular bit of an energy infrastructure is going to destroy nature, when actually what they're really meaning is going to impact on landscape. That still might be a concern, or indeed might impact on landscape when the primary concern is actually about its impact on nature. So, for example, you know, sometimes people will say, "Oh, let's put a lot of the cabling out in offshore because then we don't see it." But of course, that then has a huge impact on marine biodiversity. So it's worth just teasing this out a little.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the things people say to me is like, oh no, CPRE objecting about the visual impact. And I think it is a bit more about visual impact. And I think, you know, one of the really good examples we have is our branch in Derbyshire, who've been working with National Grid on some alternatives for the north-south transmission line that's going through their county. And I think they were really trying to see if it could hug the M1 corridor. And actually the proposal, sadly, is going through the Erewash Valley, which doesn't have any kind of infrastructure in it at all at the moment. So I think, you know, actually that's a landscape issue. It doesn't make much sense to National Grid, who have got a balance sheet of how they want it, where they want it to make sense for them. But for the people who live in the Erewash Valley, it's a huge issue.
Yeah, well, we'll for sure be coming back to this tonight. So, but it's worth just sort of talking about that difference here and now. Sometimes they align, of course. Sometimes, very often, landscape value and nature value does align. So it's not to say they don't, but sometimes they don't. Roger, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I go next to Emma Pinchbeck. So, Emma, you're Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee. Let's start by asking you, just tell us a bit about the Climate Change Committee for people that don't know.
This is fun for me. By the way, my in-laws are in this audience, so some of them technically do know what I do for a living already, other than abandon my husband to come here and speak to all of you. Thank you. So the Climate Change Committee is a statutory body that advises the UK government on the carbon budgets, and I'll come back to those, and how we might deliver against the Climate Change Act. We're also responsible for helping the UK government in terms of making the economy resilient to the impacts of climate change. There are two committees, confusingly, for the singular Climate Change Committee, one of which looks after this thing called mitigation, which is how we tackle climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, and the other is the Adaptation Committee. In between them, we have another job, which is we're the auditor for progress. So every year we publish a report, or every 2 years for adaptation, and hit the government with a stick or give them a big clap if we think that they are delivering against their commitments. The carbon budgets and the way that we do climate governance in this country has been fantastically successful, so let me tell you a bit about it. A lot of countries will have technology-specific targets. We actually sort of now have one, or sector-specific targets. Clean power by 2030 is a good example. Or they will have a decadal target, net zero by 2050, or in this case, net zero clean power by 2030, or net zero by 2030. What makes us special is we have those, but the way that we actually deliver it is through these things called carbon budgets, and they are envelopes, the maximum amounts of emissions that we can emit in the UK economy across 5-year periods. And before this job, I was the chief executive of the energy trade body. I worked at Renewable UK before that, and also at WWF. And in every one of those organisations, they liked the carbon budgets because they offered rigour. So you could see a long-term direction of travel. We set them about 12 years ahead. But also they're a looser framework, so they allow us to be surprised in delivery. And I'll give you an example of that, which is when we were first, and Craig and others were thinking about the Climate Change Act in 2008, I absolutely guarantee you they did not think offshore wind would be the main technology that was going to deliver against those early carbon budgets, because I was working in the renewable sector at the time and we did not believe that offshore wind was going to be the main technology. Innovators like Juliet and others made that technology happen. If we'd had a specific technology target, we probably would have focused on the wrong thing and not allowed stuff to come forward. So they're really brilliant as a mechanism. They also survive political turmoil because individual governments can set policies that are slightly more according to their own priorities and directions of travel, but the framework holds. Our job is to hold them to account on the carbon and their commitment. And we also do publish a pathway for delivery, so we show them how you might do it. And we have just done that for the 7th carbon budget, which is the years 2038 to 2042. And we've said, look, from where we are today, this is how we think that you can deliver all of the pre-existing carbon budgets that we haven't delivered, all the action you need to do for the next decade, out to 2040, and then a little bit beyond that as well. The most important thing about that is we are required to make it feasible. We're required to make it economically efficient, which is a way of saying as cheap as possible, or good for the economy, and we are required to consider social factors, which also is a little bit of taking people with you. And I suppose I'm the person that can say to you it is deliverable. Government might ultimately choose a different portfolio of policies and technologies. That's their job. But our job is to say, this is what you said you want to do, here's how you might do it. I've only been in post since November. I hope that explanation was okay.
It was cracking. I've never heard it described so well, actually, and so quickly. So no, very, very impressed. So and incidentally, I do remember being told categorically that offshore wind would never work.
Yeah.
Electric vehicles would never work.
Yeah. Someone reminded me the other day that actually one of my jobs when I was working in the renewable sector was to throw some shade at offshore wind because we didn't think it was going to work either, and we wanted the government to finance onshore wind. Luckily, the industry saw the light, and that's what makes it. As I said, it's what makes it really great. Most of the investment for delivering the carbon budgets is expected to come from the private sector. 60 to 90% of it, we think. It's folks like Juliet that are going to finance renewables infrastructure. So allowing the private sector to innovate whilst kind of setting a clear framework out is such a smart thing. Well done for the people that thought that up. And we definitely didn't think it was going to be offshore wind.
Yeah,
Amazing.
great. Well, you have had this, like others on the panel here, you've had this very interesting career, Emma, where you were saying there you worked for WWF, you worked for the trade body Renewables UK, and then headed up the trade body for the energy sector as a whole, Energy UK, and now you're heading up the Climate Change Committee. So if I ask you the question for tonight, how can we meet our energy needs while protecting landscapes and delivering nature's recovery? How do you start us off on that one?
So climate change has been the thing that I've worked on for most of my career, right, including when I was at WWF. And what the 7th carbon budget says, there's 400 pages of analysis, by the way, for the 7th carbon budget. By all means, get online and read all of it. But I'll tell you one of the things that surprised me when I moved over from the energy trade body, where we had been making this important case for domestic electricity, electrified heat and transport on the basis that we thought it would be cheaper for our customers after the energy crisis, and actually for national security reasons, as Juliet outlined at the beginning. I moved over to the Climate Change Committee, and everything in the media that you hear about climate change is often, I think, about land, it's about dietary change and agriculture, it's about lifestyle changes that you might be expected to make. And to my surprise, when I look through the modelling, 60% of the emissions reduction out to 2040 from today is electricity. It's all clean electricity. It's producing a lot of domestic clean electricity through various different technologies, but then critically, as Juliet said, it's using it in your homes. If you're sitting here wondering what you can do for climate change, bluntly, the thing that you can do is when you come to replace your heating system, and not before, we're not asking anyone to scrap anything, when you come to replace your heating system, get a heat pump. My mother-in-law has a heat pump. Go and ask her about hers. Very proud. When you come to replace your vehicle, get an electric vehicle. Something like 2/3 of your emissions from at household level come from those technologies, from the fossil fuel equivalents. And at system level, clean electricity drives a lot of our emissions reduction in this country, so it's really important. And that's a big change in this carbon budget, actually, because the technologies have improved. So I come at it from we need this infrastructure point of view. If you care about climate change and you're an environmentalist, there is this kind of tension in your head a bit about it, because I think a lot of people come over to the environmental movement with a really strong instinct for a landscape in the aesthetic sense. I think it's the soldiers writing home. You have this desire from when you're a small child to protect a particular species or a particular place. For me, it's here. It's where I've grown up. Generations of my family are from here. I entirely understand that. But through the work that I do, I understand that I would probably stick a pylon on it to protect it, which is such a strange cognitive dissonance, but is nevertheless true in the analysis. So that's the thing. On the nature side, the Climate Change Committee also looks at land. We do look across the whole economy. And from 2040 onwards, how we use land for particularly agriculture, but also things like tree planting, peatland restoration and nature becomes the critical sector for emissions reduction. We have to start a lot of that work now because it takes 25 years for a tree to grow. So we're also saying in this decade, lots of tree planting, lots of thoughtfulness about how we use land. We see about 10% of the land in this country changing over to be more about nature and restoration and less about agricultural production, and that includes maintaining our food security. So there's a huge land story that starts in this decade as well. It's both, not either, but I think we should confront that slight cognitive dissonance that if you love a place, as I love this place, I love it so much I married a man from here. He smelled like home when I met him. Our children are here. 10 generations of my family are from here. They farmed here. I went to school here. My mum, my gran, and I all went to the same school. The landscape that I live on is the one I would write home about. I sometimes stand on the top of the common and think, would I put a wind turbine on top of this? And I absolutely would. Another one, other than the one that you can already see. And that is part of the conversation we have to have with people. That's not appropriate in every place, but change is coming from climate change, whether you like it or not. So some change to protect these places is also acceptable, I think. There you go.
Thank you, Emma. Well, you saying put a pylon on top of it, I imagine we'll get a bit of reaction.
Yeah, this is public, isn't it? I imagine that's going to be a headline.
I think we will. We might just get to pylons a little bit tonight. But actually, before we go there, the thing that's often not talked about enough is actually the need for us to do a better job of energy saving as well, isn't it?
Yeah, hugely.
And insulation. And actually, for technologies like heat pumps, actually you need a pretty well insulated building to make for the heat pumps to work well. Can you talk to us about what the Committee on Climate Change Committee has done around that? Because actually, the UK, we've been pretty rubbish at this, haven't we? Really, historically compared to other European countries.
So it's yes, but in the. Again, another surprising thing is that heat pumps have become more efficient, so we can put them in more properties than we thought without insulating. And using electricity from the big kit on the end of the system right the way through to how we use it in your home is in itself efficient. Don't know how many of you are retired engineers, but if you can read Sankey diagrams in our 400-page report, which basically shows all the energy coming into the economy and how it comes out. And they're very beautiful charts. But in the 7th carbon budget, my favourite statistic, and it falls out of this Sankey when we model energy in the economy, is that we're making something like a a 500 terawatt hour saving on energy simply by electrifying. Now, you don't need to know what a terawatt hour is. You just need to know we halve losses of energy in the energy system by replacing importing fossil fuels to generating our own electricity and moving it around on the new grid we're going to build, and you using it in your homes and electricity. So it's like that we are reducing our energy demand across the system. And then on top of that, if you start putting, we're saying some insulation technologies in homes, and certainly for homes that are very poorly insulated, yes, that also makes a huge difference. And so you have a much more efficient energy system. That still means you do have to have a bigger power sector. So we're talking about an electricity sector, the kind of generation sector being, we're saying twice the size it is today. And that figure's coming down because of the efficiency in the system, but it's still more stuff. We need to build some more stuff to get those benefits through.
But and one of the things that will help that, so one of the big challenges for the UK is we don't have automated meter readings. And
we promised we weren't going to get niche.
That's why I didn't mention the other word. I didn't mention the other word. So if you were to go somewhere like France, you don't have to send somebody out to go and read a meter. In the UK, only 65% of our homes today are automated meter readings. One of the challenges with that, and where we don't have a handle on our meters and where they are and what they do, is like a big organisation like the Crown Estate, we've just done a complete review of it. We've found all our meters, we've now controlled them, cut energy demand by 18% just by doing that work for the last 2 years. And I can't believe that we are the only organisation who doesn't know where all their meters are. And so I think there's a huge job just to start, and actually this will help. The transformation and transition will help do that. And that can just reduce the total amount we're going to need anyhow. We're just wasting it today.
But crucially, it also smooths out the peaks, doesn't it? Which is a big thing about having, spare capacity on the network and things like that. There's a bit of that.
There's various things you can start to shave the peaks. One, you can decide that you don't need to run your transition network at the voltage we do today. So that is one transition you can immediately make. Most European networks run at 220, I think. We run at 240. We don't need to run at 240 for most of the appliances we use in our homes. So that's something you could change immediately. Right. We could also look to, so one of the things that Connected Curb is looking at is flexibility, so that you use your EV charging system to balance out that demand. So you don't plug in, you might plug in at 5 o'clock, but it doesn't start working till sort of 9 o'clock at night when the peak demand has gone down. And that makes a dramatic, I think it was something like 30 power stations are needed for that peak part between 5 and 7 in the evening in the winter. And that's a significant number. And actually, if you start to manage all of that, that changes dramatically in terms of how you manage the system.
Roger?
Yeah, we're just back on the fabric first approach. I think one of the, just to get my railing against the sort of large house builders out of the way for the evening. But, but one of the things that is incredibly frustrating is, I think one of them told me the other day that putting solar panels on the roof of a new home is equivalent to a new high-spec kitchen, and that's what people would rather have. So we're building, it's sort of like obsolescence from the beginning, and as well as, one of them proudly telling me that, their roofs wouldn't take retrofit of solar. So, that's just on the generation front, and I completely by your relationship about what that does about how you change your relationship with energy, Juliet. But I think the other thing is, we've been mucking around for a long time around building standards, and it's about time. We've got the Future Home Standard coming up later this year. I just hope we use that as an opportunity to raise the bar super high, because we've been, it is just... we can produce now homes that make you money. So why are we producing ridiculous homes that cost you money and will carry on costing you money?
Yep. Also, just I mentioned earlier that we don't mod scrappage, which is an economist's way of saying we are not assuming you have to get rid of your current car any earlier than you're planning on doing, and before you might replace it with an electric vehicle. It's the same on the heating systems. This is, bear with me on the economics. The reason for that is it's inefficient. We don't want you buying effectively two things before 2050, because the economics are such that you probably will eventually think, maybe I should buy that cheaper heat pump. There'll be fewer people on the gas grid. The kind of numbers start to stack up that electricity is the way to go. Also, by the way, if the government does something about electricity prices, then you could be saving 700 quid on your dual fuel bill by 2050. So these technologies are better. You would likely scrap your new boiler if you bought one. So we assume that you don't. It's sort of similar. That's why it is economically really inefficient for us to have to do something that should have been done from the beginning. If people are having to pay, you're effectively paying for something twice in the economy of those house builders, and then if someone else is having to pay to do the thing that should have been done in the first place. So it's just also adding to the costs of something that should be providing benefits to people from the beginning.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And just to come back, I mean, this point about energy saving, I mean, clearly the greenest form of energy is that the greenest kilowatt is the one you don't need to use because you've actually got a more efficient system or better insulated buildings and so on. But on this point about solar, Roger, I think you said just earlier tonight that in Germany, 80% of their solar is on rooftops. Is that? Did you say that?
Yeah. I mean,
and you've got a position at CPRE about trying to get a lot more solar on buildings rather than out in fields to an extent, haven't you?
Yeah, no, definitely. And we're being pragmatic. Our target is 60% of the rest of the capacity we want to build out is on rooftops. And so, getting our solar, off the ground and onto roofs is plenty of examples, both in continental Europe, but also places like Japan, like post-Fukushima, where they had to really transition very quickly from nuclear to solar. I think the other real opportunity is we've become perhaps another strange bedfellow for CPRE is the UK Warehousing Association, but I've got quite into logistic hubs, and actually a fifth of the UK's sort of largest warehouses could deliver 15 gigawatts. That's about the same as the installed solar we've got already. I mean, that's a huge figure, and I mean, as well as the sort of major house builders fobbing you off about why they can't put it on roofs on new homes. What's even more of a tragedy is big warehouse owners, when you actually track them down, saying that their business rates go up when they want to put solar on, and there's no incentive to put them beyond solar they're using. So I think there are some other opportunities. France also has had this amazing legislation on car parks over, I think it's 500, where they've insisted they put canopies with solar on as well. So it's a bit like on the homes.
Which actually helps with adaptation as well, because it
absolutely,
it
big
stops
fan
the
of solar
cars
car
getting
parks.
Yeah, solar car parks are great, but I think
retrofitting them to existing cars.
Well, retrofitting's great, and I think as well as on retrofitting, I mean, it was brilliant. I mean, I have, the government have made a couple of announcements recently. I think the Warm Homes announcement last week was brilliant to see, like some decent money going in to retrofit for social housing. I think the first GB Energy announcement being around solar for schools and hospitals, I think is brilliant. But I think we're missing some of that low-hanging fruit on logistic warehouses and hubs. If you were going to think about some priorities for the grid, actually these logistic hubs, there's a few of them around the country, feel like really important. So I think there's something about getting retrofit right alongside, the no-brainer. There was this, one of our MPs in the county here in Gloucestershire, Max Wilkinson, had a debate in Westminster just in January. We had an amazing debate, and I think we just need to see if we can get the government to kind of include mandatory, where appropriate, solar into new homes, hopefully later this year.
So, I wanted to get out to the audience if I can. If it's very
well, it is pertinent to that. So I ran a solar rooftop fund up until about 3 months ago when we sold it to somebody else. What do you think? Because it was a big challenge trying to get people to sign up.
Yeah.
Massive challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think from your having talked to the warehouse associations, because we tried to put solar on a lot of them, is it just the rates, or is it just because they can't be bothered?
I think it's on where I think there's two things on the warehouses. I think that most warehouses are rented by big players, and so finding the owners is impossible. Actually, I think we've tried to do FOIs and try and kind of find them, and they're off. God knows where they are. Who are these people who are buying warehouses? But I think there must be a way to incentivize for owners that we haven't found yet. And the rates they claim, the Warehouse Association claim the rates is a big deal. The other one is if you're a I don't know, unless you're refrigerating something at scale that's incredibly energy hungry, the incentives for you to cover the rest of your roof with solar is not quite
Maybe we should be putting some data centres in the back of all of them.
Emma.
I think I was going to make the point about incentives when you were speaking, actually, so thank you for the invitation to it. So, I mean, I was the chief executive of a trade body, and one of my jobs, particularly through the energy crisis, where energy costs for everyone, including businesses, went through the roof, was to explain why that was happening to, say, industrial players, high energy users. So, the chief execs of all the major trade bodies for automotive, logistics UK, others, are colleagues I know well. And one of the things that, so I briefed them on the 7th carbon budget. And one of the things that struck me about that conversation is the incentive for net zero is across economic sectors. So we think about energy, maybe we think about infrastructure, we think about industries, industrial users, but the incentives on net zero on the folks with the money are often down their supply chains. And I had a really interesting conversation with them. But, food retailers, for example, they're much more likely to be thinking about the carbon in their supply chain from, say, importing products, because that's what all of you will be yelling at them for in the supermarkets. Then they will be thinking about, oh, I should be putting solar panels on my roof. They're not rewarded for it either. They're not rewarded for it in ESG, environmental, social governance that exists for businesses, and they're not rewarded for it in policy, so they don't have an incentive. Can I just do something we haven't talked about, just to inflame the audience before we go to questions, which is, no one said it, but one of the reasons that there is this slight trade-off between things like rooftop or ground-mounted solar or pylons or undergrounding cables and so on is cost. Now, that isn't to say that you can't carry the cost in the economy, but on cables, for example, the CCC in our 7th carbon budget said it's mostly going to be pylons unless there is a very good reason not to, and that's because we leverage the money for that infrastructure from everybody's energy bill. Don't know if you've noticed how hard it was to pay your energy bill through the crisis, but there are a lot of people who still can't. So justifying putting additional cost on if it's not for a very, very good reason is difficult. So you go for the most efficient. Our job is to model the most efficient way of delivering net zero possible, so that's why we've done that. On ground mounted, the thing I want to say is we've modelled, it's really exciting, we've modelled land and agriculture together in this carbon budget, and that basically means we've thought about farmers and land managers as the delivery people for the solutions for climate change, as well as still emitting emissions from agriculture, from livestock farming. And we modelled 15 different types of farm and how you might replace money that farmers might be making from livestock from other things. And one of those things was ground-mounted solar. They are often not, but we can have, and we've kept food security in the budget, so we are not assuming that ground-mounted solar is going on necessarily the most productive farmland. I agree there's a planning thing to do to make sure of that. But if you remove that from farmers, it's a really good source of income. It's 25-year long with a guaranteed yield at a time when farming is becoming more uncertain because of climate change impacts, when farming is challenging for other reasons. And so we're all here from a rural community. Farming is part of this community. The farmers need that income too. So we thought that's part of the reason that I'm always nervous when we start talking, for example, about that land as being kept for maybe aesthetic reasons, not being used for farming and instead being used for solar PV, because for a farmer, they just want to make a yield from it. And that's that. And so I think that's also worth putting down, that is cost. And again, on ground mounted.
On Roger, 10 seconds.
Roger, by the way, I have a long history of having this argument.
Yeah,
10 seconds. You can see this lot will just carry on talking at night. I've got to get out to the audience. Go on.
I don't think anybody's arguing about a farmer as part of their business putting some land under solar, because I think they know their land, they know where it can make an impact and add to their business. I think what people find difficult, and we've got some good examples really nearby, like Lime Down, like Botley West, is big landowners kicking tenants off their land and surrounding, in Botley West, we've got 5 villages surrounded by solar, promoted by a big estate, funded with Russian investment. Kind of like, that's a very different prospect from a kind of family farm kind of saying, oh, I might put 200 acres under solar.
Yeah, except that too. And by the way, that's way out of the realm of what the Climate Change Committee would advise on. But we have the land use planning framework, and the government's delivery vehicle for how you do a lot of this planning exists, and it's something that they should wrestle with when they're doing that. I agree.
Right, you can see that this is a chatty lot up on the stage here tonight. And I am very much looking forward to my conversation with Roger over beer later about logistics hubs. But I did want to just flush out that about housing, because that's a huge issue. Certainly at the Wildlife Trust, we believe that if the government is trying to build 1.5 million homes in this country, every single one of those homes should have either a solar roof or a green roof. Every single one of those homes should be nature positive and very high energy efficiency standards and water efficiency standards and so on. I mean, it's a no-brainer. And it's kind of frustrating that we haven't had that commitment as clearly as we should yet. Right, to the audience here at Hawkwood tonight, please put your hand up if you want to ask a question to this amazing panel. We've also had questions come in online as well in advance of tonight. I have a question from Alicia, our host, that good one to kick us off with. And please remember, let the mic come to you. And then I'll come to this gentleman down here after.
Thank you. You just mentioned the land use framework, and for me, because I'm just being very naive, I just wondered if you could describe what that is. And sorry, just because I'm not entirely sure, and how it works.
Go on, Roger.
Yeah, I think there's a Roger question.
Yeah, you do.
So at the moment, I think we plan for land in boxes, and so we think about what we do with roads in one box, we think about what we do with housing in another box, we think about what an individual farmer does on their land is done in a whole separate box. And I think the object of a land use framework, and we're one of the few Western countries that don't have some guiding principles about what we should do with land, is to kind of bring those together. And so the government are consulting at the moment on a land use framework over the summer, and I'm banging the drum for a land use framework. I'm a great date. I would also say that there's a problem in that, because as well as consulting on land use framework, there is also an emerging energy spatial plan, and the MHLG are also developing a spatial plan for housing. So not all land use frameworks are created equal, and in a government driven by growth, I fear that kind of housing and energy tend to trump some of the other things but let's just hold the government to their word at the moment. At the moment, I think the important thing for me is which is the mama doll. And the mama doll for me is the land use framework. So the land use framework should hold all the other spatial frameworks and be some kind of guiding light for that.
So we're saying, so the government launched it just about, a month ago now. And it was launched at the Royal Geographical Society. Steve Reed gave a speech. For a geographer like myself, actually, to see the Secretary of State doing a speech talking about historical geography and spatial analysis and spatial.
You're both great dates.
If you want to get excited, actually read his speech from the launch of the land use framework. It's very exciting. Absolutely. Anyway, yes, there was a gentleman down here with a question as well. If you wait for the mic to come to you, please.
Thank you. I did live in Minchinhampton, so that's local, but I now live in Gloucester, which I noticed having been in the Stroud district, that sometimes raises a few eyebrows. Why would you want to move to Gloucester? I love Gloucester, and my question, which is more specifically, is about old housing stock. I now live in a Victorian house. I'm very curious about, maybe as part of my question, is about the possibility that heat pumps can work in poorly insulated properties, because Victorian properties can be very hard to insulate. So that's one part of it. The other is, another part of it is about heat pumps. Air source heat pumps are nowhere near as efficient as ground source. Ground source is very difficult to do personally. I got advice from an architect who said you'd have to use the whole of your garden and it would cost you £20,000. So, but what about community energy for ground source heat pumps? So that's that connectedness around the whole thing, housing stock.
Emma.
Yeah. Yeah, so I lived in a Victorian terrace, because I'm sorry I did that thing that a lot of people do where I went to London for a bit, but we've both come home now, so it's fine. But a lot of the houses around here are similarly poorly insulated. Look, the development in air source heat pump technology means you should be able to stick one in your Victorian terrace with like loft and cavity and a really good installer. If you come and find me afterwards, I'll give you the name for a really good installer. And that should be the most efficient choice for you. I certainly wouldn't be putting a single ground source heat pump in a terrace. Now, having said that, terrace houses are a particular interest and challenge, and a lot of them are in cities. And what we do for cities might look differently to what we do for detached properties in the countryside, for example. In the carbon budget advice, you can find that we also model 12 different types of household, one of which is a terrace house with a mix of technologies in. So you can see what we think that looks like, what your savings might be from it. The other thing is we should hold in our heads that there might be innovation in cities, and so heat networks are a thing. They're a thing in many European countries. We've all become used in this country to individual gas boilers. There are a couple of companies in the UK who are modelling or potentially modelling systems where you might have a shared heat pump loop and then your own individual heat pump in your home. That's an interesting innovation if it comes off. There are certainly the possibility of putting a very big heat pump on the end of a district heating system. We're already doing that in demo phase in a couple of UK cities. So I would be surprised if you couldn't get a heat pump to work in your terraced house in Gloucester, frankly. And you should come and find me about that afterwards. But equally, I do think that cities might end up doing different things. And this is where spatial planning comes in again, because we've all got a colleague who heads up the Energy Systems Catapult, who's a big advocate for local area energy planning and allowing communities to think about what they want at that local infrastructure level. So, you know, what public transport infrastructure you need, what you need to enable kind of people switching from cars to walking maybe in cities, but also more importantly, what you want to do about the heating network. In your instance, I probably wouldn't wait. I reckon it's probably quite cost effective for you to do a heat pump, but you come and find me afterwards.
Emma, thanks. Juliet.
Yeah, so I have both. I have an old house and I built a new cottage for my dad to live in. New cottage, 400% efficiency because we've got underfloor heating, super insulated. It's amazing. It's really quiet. My old one, I'm very jealous of his heat pump because it's small and pretty. Mine is very large and ugly and a bit loud. But then I've had it for 12 years. And it heats a pretty wind, there's a lot of prevailing wind that gets into my house, put it that way. So it does work. It works much better. I did put some underfloor heating in. It works much better with that. On this system, so one of the companies I work with is actually doing ground source. So the thing that we specialize is an IP which has a spiral trench digging. So in other words, the small footprint on the surface is much smaller than you would need with traditional ground source heat pumps. It's not going to necessarily work for a domestic household, but we've just put in for planning, I can't remember where it is actually, which is with a low temperature loop, as Emma was talking about. So you put a low temperature loop in, and then you condense the heat from that low temperature loop into the household with a very small heat pump, essentially, into the individual households. And that technology is already there. We're looking to deploy it in the next 2 to 3 years. And then there's a lot of the ground source is working on schools. So we're just quoting for 3 schools at the moment, and we've done a lot of universities. Universities have moved forward now because there were some government grants towards universities. And particularly when they're in cities, when there's not a lot of space, actually ground source works really well.
Roger.
Just a shout out on the community energy, actually, just because I think, just picking up on Juliet's points from the beginning, I think, there are some cracking examples out there for communities coming together to rethink their energy and rethink some solutions. And I think just in terms of, that hope around taking people with you on the journey, I think, they're growing in scale. I think in other bits of the world, they've been able to scale them up quicker. But whenever I go around the country and meet with our groups, there's always a great kind of group of people proselytizing about community energy, and it feels to me there's some energy there we need to ride with.
Can I just add last in this, because I think it's worth saying to an audience, these are very common technologies in other places. Yeah. Like a lot of Europe, a lot of places colder than us, with colder winters than us, have heat pumps and have done for a long time. I think your example highlights something which we're aware of, which is you do need an installer base that really knows the technologies and knows what it's doing and can help you, because they are new. And then once they're in, they're new. And I've been trying to articulate this, which is your life doesn't have to change hugely, actually, in what we can see in order for the UK to meet its climate targets. That has to change a bit. But you'll still have a warm home, you'll still have a heating system and a car, and and there is still change required. When you come to replace your heating system, you need to have a new heating system, and it will be for you like it must have been for people going from a solid fuel boiler to a condensing boiler. I've just moved house. My house is a 1970s house. The heat loss on it, I'll cheer you up, the heat loss on my house is sufficient that when the heat pump installer looking at our house saw it, he was like, do you live in a barn? And no, it's just no one apparently in the 1970s put any insulation in whatsoever. So we're working on that, but I think the thing about it is the heat pump in our house will still work. I've got a really good installer that has been able to help me with that. If there are two things in this, if we can make electricity cheaper, a slightly less efficient heat pump doesn't matter as much because the electricity is cheap. I mean, waste is bad in an economy, I realise, but the cost to you will be less. And also, I think we can learn lessons from how other countries have done this rollout. So I think a lot of it is about making sure we've got skilled people. And then when you've got your heat pump system in as well, understanding how you use it effectively. And some of the things that we were talking about metering and having the right tariff for it and understanding how you use it will also help you. So we need to walk people through this change, even though the ultimate thing isn't a huge amount of change in how you live your life.
Thanks, Emma. Okay, I'm going to bridge us back to, by taking one of the questions that we had submitted in advance from our online audience to the issues around nature and landscape and so on. Peter Dorr asked the question, how do we as a country get renewable energy sources connected to the national grid as quickly as possible when the local population are understandably objecting to the erection of pylons in their locality? I mean, Juliet, this is something you and I have talked about quite a lot. Not least, I don't think we're giving too much away, saying in the Clean Power Commission we've talked about this and actually how we can make sure that we do clean power in a nature-positive way and how that's important for building the support of local communities. But this is a hot topic.
It is a hot topic. And I think one of the reasons it's such a hot topic is because the decisions around this have been delayed for about 10 to 15 years. So essentially, National Grid has needed to, I think I was on the Renewables Advisory Board, I can't even remember when it was. I think it was in 2007 or something ridiculous, where we outlined that we needed National Grid extension. We needed investment in National Grid, and at the time the regulatory framework wasn't in place to allow that to happen properly. So we changed the law, and actually there's a piece of legislation they were talking about the other day that allows us to do that. But nobody's used it. So for the last 10 to 15 years, we've been piling up the plans for doing the investment in the National Grid, but we haven't done them. And the reason we haven't done them is nobody's wanted to have this very difficult debate about landscape, nature, and infrastructure. And that's the debate we absolutely need to have now, because we can't afford not to have it anymore. From an energy point of view, we're at a point where we need to move forwards. But we need to be brave and have that, because I think that's what's happened is progressive governments have not been brave, have not wanted to have this debate, and so have just put it on the sideline, tried to ignore it. And we're now at a point we can't ignore it anymore. So,
and it's worth saying, isn't it? There's an issue about how you mitigate the damage to landscape or nature. So, for example, within that debate, there's a lot of debate at the moment on land about whether it's right to create pylons or whether the cable should be undergrounded or not. Within that, there's a bit of a technical debate, and I might come to you this in a moment, Emma, you'll be delighted to know about the difference between high voltage alternate current, HVAC, or HVDC, direct current, and that needs much, the AC, which is what we do at the moment, needs much bigger trenches, and it's a much bigger deal to put underground than have I got that the wrong way around?
Yeah, Julian, I think you've got that the wrong way
Yeah,
around.
I think it's the other way around.
Either way around,
Big trenches for HVDC.
That's right, yeah, exactly.
I mean, big trenches full stop, if
So
I'm
there's a
honest.
big argument here, and there's even debates about which one's cheaper and which one's better and all this kind of stuff. And then there's arguments about, actually, well, if you do have to do this anyway, however you do it, can you take the opportunity to create sort of linear infrastructure for nature at the same time? If actually you're going to put these things in, actually can you create wildlife corridors over the trenches, underneath the pylons, or at sea, where they're putting the cables linking offshore wind? One of the things that as a Wildlife Trust we're asking the question about is at the moment those are deep trenched to protect them actually from bottom trawling. But actually, if you stopped bottom trawling, where you put the cables, which you should do from a nature point of view anyway, you could just lay the cables on the seabed and it would be much better for nature. So this is a complicated area. There's the issue about mitigation, and there's the implications also about actually trying to restore nature. Roger.
So I mean, I think it's important. I think there's a couple of things that are important. One is, like, we're hardwiring some infrastructure that has an impact not just about the transmission, but about what the transmission then takes for, what opportunities people might say the transmission creates. So just on the transmission, and I think it's right, it's worth remembering we've got this aged transmission network centered around these hulking, great kind of coal-fired power stations we don't need anymore. So we've got a big job to do. So I think a few things. Where it makes sense, double up. I think that there's almost like a hierarchy of how to make these decisions. So where it makes sense, double up. A bit like that CPRE Derbyshire argument about, if you can run it along existing infrastructure, do that.
The M1.
The M1 thing.
Yeah.
I think if we are, one of the conversations I've been having with the grid is about decommissioning. If some stuff just doesn't make any sense anymore, can we take it down? And then in protected landscapes, underground. And I think, the underground, where we've done, National Grid have done some great undergrounding in protected landscapes. I think there's an argument about you've got to get that right ecologically. So, you wouldn't want to dig up a flower-rich meadow in order to underground a electricity cable. But, if you're digging up a...
So it's a case-by-case basis.
It's a case-by-case basis, but, the arguments where undergrounding's worked, I just want to reference the Danes again. But I think the other thing that's important about the hardwiring the infrastructure is about, one of the kind of the channels of tension that I'm feeling at the moment is with our branches down the East Coast on the Norwich to Tilbury route, who are working. It's not the transmission, I think, that people are frustrated about. I think it's the speculative solar developments of developments at scale that are being chucked in at every point along that transmission spine. And I think they are the things where people feel we've lost control over this. I think there is a
lot of opposition to pylons in parts of East Anglia, though.
There's a particular thing, but I think if you look at, there was a great quote, there was an amazing Labour MP, the Labour MP for Suffolk Coastal yesterday, who was speaking in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. So there's a big Planning and Infrastructure Bill going through the Houses of Parliament at the moment. And she called what was happening in her constituency, given that she's, got some of the most cracking heathland, in the country, she said it was uncoordinated whack-a-mole. And I think for some of the people in those communities, that's what it feels like, is not only are they dealing with some huge transmission at scale, these huge networks of kind of landfall for offshore that sometimes don't feel they're joined up. And on top of that, a bunch of speculative solar applications that, are just adding to the tension on those landscapes.
So, Emma, you rightly corrected me earlier. I just glanced at my notes and I did get that the wrong way around. So just to be clear, high voltage alternate current, it requires big trenches. That's what we've had for years.
I mean, it's
and direct current, much smaller trenches.
So you have to dig a trench, full stop. I think that's the thing that always surprises people. And when we're talking about trenches, we're talking about big trenches. I mean, I'm looking at the width of this room, not far off the width of this room. I think people think it's like telecoms, where it's like a small cable that runs through. These are high voltage cables. There's a reason that we build a big trench.
And associated works and everything.
And associated works and everything else. So, as Roger was just saying, as the soil guy, one of the things that we might worry about as environmentalists is like digging the hole is in itself disruptive for some precious landscapes, peatland, heather, other. But we have successfully undergrounded cables in some sites of special scientific interest or in protected areas, and that can be the right thing to do. Basically, HVDC is newer. It's a newer kind of cable, but they are using it. We do use it for some of the offshore wind sites. We will use it on the system. It can be cheaper in the long run if you do it far enough out in advance. However, what we are doing in the UK is building onto an aging infrastructure, and we're building at speed, and we're building because we have to in order to, amongst other things, get off Russian gas. and in order to, amongst other things, reduce energy bills for people, and in order, amongst other things, to deliver on our climate change ambitions. And so you're not starting with a blank sheet. And if you're starting with a blank sheet, maybe you would do a whole load of stuff through HVDC, but we're not. And even if you were, you still got to go over the trenching problem. Because of that, it's very expensive often. So we're saying that to underground cables, it's about 3 times the cost of doing it overground. And not in every case, but in a lot of cases. And so if there is a good justification for burying a cable, you have to square that away with who pays for it. And is it fair? Especially when quite, like in the history of energy systems, often your demand, where your towns and cities are not where you can build a flipping enormous power station. We haven't done that since we had coal-fired stations inside central London. Often you have to move the energy from a place where there is space for the infrastructure to the place where people need it. This has always been tense for the different, the kind of collision of local and national, the collision of like price and speed and long term. And I have just become, I suppose I'm exhorting that we should get used to that discomfort. We are still capable of nuance. Like we're still capable of having a discussion. 2 things I think that are more concrete recommendations than just philosophizing about this. 1, we ran a citizens panel for the carbon budget this time, and it echoed the findings of every poll I've ever seen, but also the UK-wide Citizens' Assembly, in that the public said very clearly they wanted to understand what the government wanted them to do. And generally speaking, if they had a deliberative process, if they were able to discuss things and have input and understand these trade-offs and have an adult conversation, they were more ambitious than any of us could have imagined, and they were very happy to accept compromises, like more than we at the Climate Change Committee, or in fact anyone, were asking them to do. So communication is really important. I completely agree. I think the second thing on the infrastructure and the cost, which could be helpful, is this idea of using the strategic plan, using the land use framework, doing some proper thinking about how you might make sure it doesn't feel like whack-a-mole for people. And in the process of that, work out where your trade-offs are on sometimes cost and other. And lastly on cost, if they're going to do more expensive things, finding a way of financing it that isn't on energy bills would be very sensible. And the primary recommendation of the Climate Change Committee is we have to move these policy costs off electricity, which is where they sit, and one, make electricity cheap so all of you are incentivized to get things like electric vehicles and heat pumps. But also because some of the politics of this is we're putting the costs up to build a thing that should be cheap for people. And I think for many people, getting a social benefit is getting a lower energy bill can, in some cases, ease some of those concerns. Can I, very lastly, in the 1960s when we upgraded the grid, all of this happened. And I know it happened because I've got the adverts from Country Life magazine from 1960, where they wrote out to the public and said, look, people in England, if you would like people in Wales to have electricity, you are going to need to have some pylons, because where we generate the electricity is in England, and where the people need it is in Wales. Now, you can say you don't want the pylons to come here, but you have to go and tell people in Wales that they can't have electricity. And we, as the government, don't think that's right, and that's why we're building these. They did the same thing with some children, and they said, we would like your children to have cheap fuel powers the economy, we need to do this upgrade. Where will you tell your children that you don't want the pylons? It was slightly more sophisticated than that, but I did think, I can't imagine a world where the government would be willing to do that now, but that is the sort of conversation we need to have, and I think you're all grown-ups. I think understanding some of these nuances is important.
I really want to get out to other questions.
Sorry.
Is that right?
But there's just
very quick.
Particularly on infrastructure, one of the key issues as well is that we have to actually centrally plan what we're doing. One of the big issues on the original way was when any wind farm or any site could put in an application to actually ask for a grid connection, you were going to end up with 2 to 3 times the number of grid connection requirements on the UK coast than if we centrally planned where they were going to do much more efficiently. So there are some, we're already doing that. So we are now doing that, but there are some very interesting sort of philosophical ways of doing things like market-led approach that just won't work, and we can minimise impact by being much more thoughtful about it.
I completely agree with that. Yeah.
So I mean, just to say, a lot of this is true for the land, but also for the sea. So we talked about the importance of a land use framework. We at the Wildlife Trust would say we need the equivalent in the marine environment. We need the planning that you're talking about there for grids, and so you need that probably in the marine environment, rather case by case as well. And I think, you know, one of the things we conclude from this discussion, it's worth saying a lot of this is quite contested by communities at the moment as to, you know, the different costs of HVDC and HVAC and all of these things, that there's a lot of suggestions of different solutions out there. And it does, one of the things that is kind of clear is there's a lot more debate to be had about this. And I think one thing that probably we can all agree is actually the best answers are developed on a case-by-case basis, but under the framework you've just been talking about, Juliet. I think that's kind of where things seem to land. Let's get out for another question, please. Yes, up here at the front, please. Yeah, gentleman here has been very patient, and then a lady next to him, I think, is then. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Let's take 3 questions at once just to get them out, because this lot know how to talk. So it means if you guys can just, then you can react. I want to get as many questions as I can in the short time we've got, and then I'll come to you guys at the end, and you react to the ones that you get most excited about, which I think might be all of them. Gentleman here.
Yeah, I'm Chris Utley. I'm the Climate Change Manager with Stroud District Council, and such a rich selection of questions, but I want to move. We're not just a Cotswold district, we're a coastal district, and we've got the Severn Estuary, and we've just seen the Western Gateway Commission report upon energy potential within the Severn Estuary. We've got potential small modular reactors. We also know, I've got a background in flood risk as well, we've got unremitting sea level rise occurring on that estuary, irrespective of what we do with emissions for the next several centuries. So I just wonder if the panel want to comment on the technologies, the nature interest for Craig, and the landscape interest as well, and potentially the kind of the impact on the communities around there, on that kind of the sea level rise implications.
Thanks so much. Lady next to you, please.
Thank you. Chloe Turner, Chair of the Environment Committee at Stroud District Council. Probably sort of slightly related question, really. You know, we know that action and the co-benefits around nature and climate are really closely linked. I suppose I'm a bit concerned to hear language around it being very easy as long as we focus on changing our energy usage, and that not too much behaviour change is needed. Whereas a lot of the nature things, so encroachment in nature that comes from noise, light, physical pollution from tyres, for example, of vehicle transport, if we don't change the way we move around the landscape, nature is going to get impacted. So just pushing back a bit on that, you know, making it clear we do need to change our behaviour, even if we also change our energy.
Very good, thank you. And then if we can bring the microphone over to the other side of the... Over here, yeah, thank you very much.
Hello, my question relates to the last two, actually, about human behaviour. And it was mentioned earlier that we need to think about reaching out to people, what I would call the social science perspective, rather than a technological perspective. And my question is really about waste, that we do an awful lot of things that impact our environment, as Chloe is just saying, but we also... how far do we think about turning down the heat in our homes to reduce the demand? How far do we think about not wasting 50% of the food that we buy? And if we could address some of those behavioural challenges, then perhaps we would have less impact on less greedy of nature.
Great, thank you very much. Gentleman 2 behind, has been waiting patiently. Hope you guys are keeping notes.
Thank you. Lovely woke discussion this evening, so thank you very much for that. I've come from a community energy event in Bristol today, and there is so much enthusiasm and desire to get community energy moving. And we've heard talk about how we can get people to move to different technologies. I firmly believe that getting communities to buy into community energy, such as Ambition, Lawrence Weston have got the largest wind turbine down on Avonmouth, an amazing transformative thing. I personally would love to see wind turbines in a community. I think there will be buy-in for them if the community got the benefits rather than some French-based multinational. Let's keep it local and you will get buy-in.
Okay, thank you. And I'll do one more from here in Stroud. If there's, I thought there was another hand. Yeah, gentleman here. Oh, yes, definitely. You might want to introduce who you are.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew McLaughlin. I'm the CEO at Gloucester Wildlife Trust, following on from Roger. So my question is, can we really do nature and climate at the same time? It feels like we should be, but can we?
Great. Okay, Emma, I'll come to you first, please. Of which ones of those do you want to really go into? And I reckon I reckon the panelists have got 2 minutes
two lines each. All
two,
right.
2 minutes each.
So in no particular order, I know this is a bit of a cop-out and only a slight one. So on things like, on behaviour change, this is really uncomfortable for people when I tell them, particularly audiences like you guys, because you want me to be able to tell you that the thing on carbon is the modal shift, which is the economists speak for, like, not driving and using public transport or bikes, and particularly actually for when we talk to local government, that's often been a big focus of work. And that's really important, and if you want to go further and make buses, please God, as a local resident, easier, yes, of course, but actually you can get there on the carbon with EVs. Now, that doesn't do the thing that you're describing about things like particulates from tyres and the rest of it, but bluntly, that's not my job. And the biggest challenge facing nature is at the moment, on a personal level, is climate change. So if you've got to get the most efficient way of getting people to tackle climate change, electric vehicles are a big part of the solution. We do work with the Office for Environmental Protection, who pick up some of the impacts that you're talking about on things like runoff and plastics. So we try, we have an agreement with them that we share our analysis and try and do things that are co-benefit. They saw the 7th carbon budget. Behaviour change is important. It is in the carbon budget. We're asking people to eat a bit less meat, following dietary trends, but it is much less significant than people think. The boiler in your house, the car you drive. Those are and if you fly more than once a year on holiday, or you fly regularly on holiday, the flights that you take. But it is possible to meet the carbon budgets with people taking an annual family holiday, and particularly low-income households for whom that's really important. That's still possible. It's possible to meet the carbon budgets and for people to still eat some meat. It is possible to meet the carbon budgets and still drive a vehicle. It is possible to meet the carbon budgets and still heat your home. So it's a really important thing for people to understand. Behaviour change is really important. It shows up less in the model than you would think. It's important for lots of other reasons, and I personally go further than the carbon budgets, but it nevertheless, for net zero, not as big as everyone always wants it to be. On community energy benefits, absolutely really important, and I agree with you that people feeling the benefits of renewables is really important, for the scale that we're talking about, you are going to need grid scale power plant. The financing that is expensive. I'm totally comfortable with the private sector financing it. I think we've got 99 other things that we also need to finance as a country, not least we've been talking about heat pumps. So I think that is fine. I think making electricity cheap so that people feel the benefits of the renewables on the system benefits everyone. Having those renewables on the system has already saved you money from displacing imported gas. It's also important to say that, but absolutely they should benefit people, and there is a role for community energy. On Stroud, we don't get into specific technology mixes, apart from we have all of them in the model. So we have some nuclear in the model. We've got renewables of all kinds in our model for the 7th carbon budget. I'd be really interested to see what local authorities do. And maybe I can pick up with you on flooding and landscape change separately, but it sounds like you're going down the right thing. And lastly, on waste, it's important economically and socially that we use fewer resources. We've got quite a bit of things like energy from waste in the model, actually. So using that as a power source, being more thoughtful about waste and recycling is actually important for reducing emissions as well. So that's a sector in the carbon budget. I think that's a canter through most of them.
Thank you very much, Emma. Roger.
just to pick up on Chris's point first about landscapes and sea level rise and this particular place and landscapes, you know, we've got, you know, the most important nature corridor we have in this county is the River Severn, by a long chalk. I think there is something about the fact that landscapes aren't set in aspic, and actually the way that we have worked in that landscape is going to have to change. You know, we haven't talked much about adaptation, but, you know, one of the critical bits is that we're going to have to think differently about water in this place. We're going to have to think differently about floodplains and really differently about a river that suffers both, not suffers, but has got both sea level rise to contend with and also a lot of very fast water coming down from the catchment. So I think the critical thing for me, and I think it ties in with the nature and climate thing, you know, I think we can envision a kind of a different landscape in the Severn Estuary that is more nature rich, that is delivering more benefits in terms of flood resilience and feels like it has some benefits for humans too. So I would say that just on nature and climate, I think I would say, like to Andrew's point, like it obviously has to be, and we've got to find a way through that. And I think, you know, they are two halves of the same coin. You can't separate. I would just chuck in the kind of 30 by 30, just because we're in a wildlife trust place, so why not, you know? So, but I think if we're going to deliver by 30, you know, I think,
which is getting 30% of our land and sea in recovery by 20.
Land and sea in recovery by 30. That's another important land target that just sometimes, like the reality of that land target is huge. And I think sometimes when we're thinking about, like, you know, misuse of land, whether it's in housing or on energy infrastructure, and thinking about, oh, we can't, well, no, this is just the cheapest way to go, these bargain basement solutions, I think we need to think again, because these other targets that are very easy to fall to the bottom of the priority list would, you know, soon, you know, they won't be deliverable unless we think really differently about our brownfield land, unless we think really differently about getting solar onto roofs. And finally, I'd just say about just behaviour change, completely agree, but let's change the language. You know, like one of the things I would say, and I hope it's changing, I kind of feel a subtle bit of change from the government yesterday, just in the discussion on the bill. But if you want to take people with you on the journey, and if you want people to change their behaviour, don't call them NIMBYs, don't talk about builders and blockers, don't have this divisive language that makes people feel they're wrong. I just think it's a false start from the government. I'm disappointed in it, and I think I feel it changing. I hope it's changing. It's part of what we say to government day in, day out. But I think, you know, if people are going to change their behaviour, they want to feel like they're a contender and they're part of the process that we want them to take.
Right.
The journey.
So, absolutely, very, very brief.
Very quickly on the empathy, I should have said, by the way, you can do nature and climate change together. And there's lots of, you know, I've talked about them: trees, broadland, leaf trees, hedgerow planting. Using nature as a solution to climate is all over the carbon budgets as well. So yes, and of course we should be doing things like wildflower meadows under pylons. That's one of the reasons that pylons exist. You can kind of do things alongside them. So completely you can do both. Most studied raptor in the world now is a raptor that tends to fly around wind turbines, because as a consequence of the renewables development, the renewables industry was required to study them. And as a consequence, with a fantastic data set on a particular kind of bird of prey that has resulted from the renewable sector. So there's loads of examples of like wildlife, nature and infrastructure working hand in hand. Just on the empathy point, the reason I go hard on behaviour change is also about empathy, which is we're all sitting in a room of probably the converted. And I've just come off the back of a job where I spent most of my time talking to people who could not pay their energy bill. They could not feed their children because of their energy costs. And that is the level that a lot of people are engaging with this agenda on. Will it make my life easier? And so I think it is also really important that if there are solutions where people will just adopt them because they are modern technology that makes their life easier, I am fine with that, whether or not they care about climate change and the environment. So that's, I think that's also empathy of a kind.
Juliet, last word.
I'm going to stick to 2 points. So I am going to talk about community, and I'm going to talk about behaviour change. So on community, I mean, community, we all want community energy. Everybody feels that community energy is a great thing. It's the way forwards. The issue is it doesn't always work everywhere. So you can use community energy very powerfully in certain areas. And there are various aspects of community energy that you need to engage with. One, there needs to be a community close to a potential for renewable energy. So that's number one. Number two, it needs to have enough capital if it wants to own it. So that you need to have a relatively wealthy community. So I think there are various communities that can do that, absolutely. But there are some real challenges with it. And I think we're seeing Ripple, Ripple Energy, having some real challenges at the moment with the business model that they've developed. The other thing for communities is that they don't always have the technical know-how within the community to be able to deliver. So I think we can use community energy, but we need to think about where it works well, and if we want it to apply, for example, in a social housing context, what does it mean in that context? So I think we need to explore it a little bit more in terms of how do we deliver it and how do we give accessibility to a wider set of people to a community energy base. And then coming back to the behaviour change, I mean, in early years, many years ago, there was something called the Great Green Community Fund, which went out to communities across the UK to look at the best community energy systems. And one of them was an energy advice system, community where they had one expert and 50 volunteers who went door to door to their neighbours to go and chat to them about energy. And we went round and visited some of these people. And I met this guy who was about 80 years old. And he showed us around his home about everything he'd done. And what was really interesting is the big transformation was the technology into his home. So he put a solar panel on his roof, and he used to count how much energy it used to produce, and he used to shift all his demand related to that energy. So I do fundamentally believe that the technology itself can support behavioural change. And quite often you'll have, there are some people who will have their spreadsheets out and they'll be monitoring energy prices and be able to trade on a half-hourly basis. And that will be about 1% of the UK population. The rest of us who are somewhat more lazy, I include myself in that, need technology to help us change. So I think that the technology and the behavioural change actually, if you bring it to consumers well enough, actually goes hand in hand.
Brilliant, Juliet. Thank you very much. We've had a very rich conversation tonight around trying to answer the question, how can we meet energy needs while protecting landscapes and delivering nature's recovery? Really grateful to everyone that submitted questions online. Really grateful to the audience here in Hawkwood for that. It's worth saying that for us at the Wildlife Trust, I find myself reflecting that often in these kind of debates, we talk about the need to balance things. We talk about the need to balance energy production and protection of nature. We need to talk about balancing food security or building houses and so on. But I think one of the things we really believe at the Wildlife Trust is actually, although that word balance sounds nice at first, actually often it suggests these things are in conflict. And it's much better to talk about how we can integrate the development of a new clean energy infrastructure at the same time as rebuilding our natural infrastructure, recognising that the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world and we have to deliver this clean power mission. Doesn't it make sense to do the two together in an integrated way rather than have two problems that are completely separate? Doesn't it make sense to build new houses at the same time as restoring nature and helping deliver on the clean power target as well? Doesn't it make sense to produce food at the same time as restoring nature and delivering on climate adaptation? And so the more that we can integrate these big things that are needed in society, the more likely we are to deliver them and in the kind of the solutions that we really need. So I want to say a huge thank you to the brilliant panellists tonight. Emma Pinchbeck from the Climate Change Committee, Roger Mortlock from CPRE, the Countryside Charity, Juliet Davenport, founder of Good Energy and board of Crown Estate, and many other things as well. And a huge thanks to you in the audience here at Hawkwood. Please give a big round of applause. And thanks so much for watching this episode of Wildlife Tonight. We're regularly getting thousands of people watching these, so thank you very much for joining us tonight. And the next Wildlife will be next month in May, and I can tell you now it's going to be focused on the brilliant concept that is ecocide, and we'll be having a good look at that. So make sure you join us for the next Wildlife in May. And in the meantime, it just leaves us to finish here in Stroud tonight, and I'm going to go with Roger and talk about logistic hubs. Thanks so much. Good night.
I think logistic hubs are really interesting.